The Book of Judges, Part 4. In the last study, we had begun with one named Jephthah, which in Hebrew is Yiftah. His name means he opens. This Jephthah would be a type of Christ, because who is it that opens and no man shutteth, as written in the book of Revelation chapter 2 and chapter 3. Jephthah was a mighty man of valor, and he was cast from his father's house by his brethren, because he was the son of an harlot, and they did not want him to have the inheritance. But we need to consider some things by spiritual example here. What would Mary, the mother of Christ, have been considered in her times if she, being pregnant before she was married, had said, God is the father of my child, because an angel came unto me and said, you shall conceive and bear a child, and thou shalt call his name Emmanuel. What would have happened to her if she had said that? Well, of course, she would have been called a heretic, and she would have been scored and then called a harlot. And there are even some websites now, and a new movie coming out, which claims that she was a harlot and raped by a Roman, and a Roman was actually the father of Christ. I'd hate to be in the directors and producers' shoes on the day of judgment. But again, she would have been scored and called a harlot. Now, Jephthah was cast out from his own house. In other words, he was not to have the inheritance by his own brethren. But when the Ammonites came to war against Israel, guess who they went running to? Israel sought out this one Jephthah, the elders of Israel. And in Jephthah, again we have a type of Christ who is cast out of his father's house. In other words, Christ was cast out of his father's house and killed by the scribes and Pharisees, aka the Kenite portion of them. Yet, he would free the faithful, which Israel is symbolic of, from oppression by his sacrifice on the cross and become judge over them, because he is King of Kings and Lords of Lords. And this Jephthah would inherit more than his father's house, because he would become a ruler in Israel, which is what the book of Judges is all about. The rulers of Israel. Judges, rulers. The word is shofetim in Hebrew. Anyway, this Jephthah inherited more by becoming ruler in Israel, or amongst this particular group, than he would have ever gotten from his father's inheritance. But the parable of the wicked husbandman, written in Matthew chapter 21, might help you to understand the analogy a little better of this one Jephthah, that he was a type of Christ. I say a type, an example. Now, then we had seen Israel fall away again, as so many times before. It's hard to number how many times Israel has fallen away ever since the day they were brought out of Egypt, because they fell many times while Moses was alive, and then after his death, and during the lifetime of Joshua they fell, and Joshua warned them. And after Joshua died, they fell a number of times with many different judges over them. But then we've now reached the point where one called Samson was risen up by the Lord, of the tribe of Dan, a Nazarite, who had strength beyond measure because he was blessed of God. And he had slain many and taken vengeance upon the Philistines for what they had done to his wife, and because they tried to take him, and even his brother Judah turned against him. So we will see a type of Christ even in this one, a little bit. We will also see the frailty and the forgetfulness and the fleshly wiles of man in this one Samson. So this is where we're going to pick it up in the book of Judges chapter 16 and verse 1. And before we begin, as always, let us go to our Father's throne and ask for guidance and wisdom as we study this, His most precious word. Glorious Heavenly Father and King of everything, Creator of everything, we come before you this day, Father, and we ask for wisdom and guidance as we study this, your word. We ask you to reveal the deeper secrets to us, Father, the analogies, the types and examples, and the literals. We know that you are the giver of all wisdom, Father, and we look to you to be able to understand your word through the gift of your hand upon these studies. And we ask also, Father, that you open the eyes and ears of all who study with us, that they too may receive the truth and understanding from the study of this, your word. And we ask these things, Father, in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, Yahushua Messiah, Jesus, the only and true Christ, I should say. Amen. So, Judges chapter 16, verse 1. Then went Samson to Gaza, and there saw an harlot, and went in unto her. I believe we've mentioned what going in unto a woman means. In other words, he laid with her. Verse 2. And it was told the Gazites, saying, Samson is come hither. And they compassed him, and laid wait for him all night. And the Gazites are, of course, the Philistines, in the gate of the city. And were quiet all night, saying, In the morning when it is day, we shall kill him. Verse 3. And Samson lay till midnight, and arose at midnight, and took the doors of the gate of the city, and the two posts, and went away with them, bar and all. In other words, he just picked up the entire gates of the city, which were locked, no doubt, which would have kept him from being able to leave, and pulled the doors and carried them with him. And he put them on his shoulders and carried them up to the top of a hill that is before Hebron. Verse 4. And it came to pass afterward that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. This is going to be a little bit of trouble for Samson. Verse 5. And the lords of the Philistines came unto her, and said unto her, Entice him, and see wherein his great strength lieth, and by what means we may prevail against him, that we may bind him to afflict him. And we will give thee, every one of us, 1,100 pieces of silver. It's quite a lot. They want this guy really bad, Samson. Verse 6. And Delilah said to Samson, Tell me, I pray thee, wherein thy great strength lieth, and wherewith thou mightest be bound to afflict thee. Now, of course, this is subtle. Why don't you just tell me what makes you so strong and what I can do to take your strength away from you and afflict you? Apparently she had that money all on her mind. Verse 7. And Samson said unto her, If they bind me with 7 green withs that were never dried, then I shall be weak and be as another man. In other words, weak as any other man. And 7 green withs here are probably the leftovers of vines or some sort of hanging vine. In other words, something that would be strong enough to bind a normal man. Verse 8. Then the lords of the Philistines brought unto her 7 green withs, which had not been dried, and she bound him with them. Verse 9. Now there were men lying wait. In other words, they're lying in wait to kill him, abiding with her in the chamber. In other words, they're hidden in there. And she said unto him, The Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And he brake the withs as a thread of tow. Tow, of course, is a wick of a candle, is broken when it touches fire. So his strength was not known. In other words, they couldn't discern how strong this guy was, but they knew he was powerful. Verse 10. And Delilah said unto Samson, Behold, thou hast mocked me, and told me lies. Now tell me, I pray thee, wherewith thou mightest be bound. Verse 11. And he said unto her, If they bind me fast with new ropes, which were never occupied, in other words, never used, then I shall be weak as another man, in other words, as any other man. Verse 12. Therefore Delilah took new ropes, and bound him therewith, and said unto him, The Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And there were liers in wait abiding in the chamber. And he brake them from off his arms like a thread. Verse 13. And Delilah said unto Samson, Hitherto thou hast mocked me, and told me lies. Tell me wherewith thou mightest be bound. And he said unto her, If thou weavest the 7 locks of my head with a web, in other words, kind of like with a net, verse 14, and she fastened it with a pin, and said unto him, The Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And he awaked out of his sleep, and went away with the pin of the beam. In other words, she had fastened his hair to a beam, which is a piece of wood, no doubt, maybe even the support of the tent they were in, or something there too, and with the web. Verse 15. And she said unto him, How canst thou say, I love thee, when thine heart is not with me? Thou hast mocked me these 3 times, and hast not told me wherein thy great strength lieth. Verse 16. And it came to pass, when she pressed on him daily with her words, and urged him, so that his soul was vexed unto death. In other words, he was heart-struck by her, totally in love with her, and was vexed unto death. In other words, thought he was going to die if he couldn't have her. Verse 17, that he told her all of his heart, and said unto her, There hath not come a razor upon mine head, for I have been a Nazarite unto God from my mother's womb. If I be shaven, then my strength will go from me, and I shall be weak, and be like any other man. And of course, we have a symbology here of the hair is the veil. And what is our veil? It is Christ. And without Christ, we are powerless. Yes, but we're reading this from the Old Testament, and how can you speak of Christ? This is our Father's Word. And God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And He's giving us examples here so that we can understand the power of Christ and the analogies and what Christ meant to us. So in other words, if his head is shaven, this goes against the vow of a Nazarite. His head was not to be shaven. Again, the hair is symbolic of the veil. In other words, it was symbolic of his strength. Verse 18. And when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, in other words, she knew that he had spake the truth to her, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, Come up this once, for he hath showed me all his heart. Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought money in their hand. In other words, they're ready to pay. They've got their bounty. Verse 19. And she made him, being Samson, sleep upon her knees. And she called for a man, and she caused him to shave off the 7 locks of his head. And she began to afflict him, and his strength went from him. Now, how many locks did it say were on his head? 7. What is 7 symbolic of in the Bible? Spiritual completeness. In other words, every time you see the number 7, whether it be 7, 70, 700, 7,000, whatever, it's symbolic of completion. This is why there are 7,000 elect. There are actually more than 7,000 elect, but the number is given as 7,000 because it means spiritually complete. Verse 20. And she said, "The Philistines be upon thee, Samson." And he awoke out of his sleep and said, "I will go out as other times before and shake myself." In other words, and he was going to beat the tar out of them or whatever, get up and stalk off like he had done before. And he wist not that the Lord was departed from him. In other words, he wasn't aware that the Lord had departed from him, and apparently he wasn't aware his hair was missing either, or at least yet. Verse 21. But the Philistines took him and put out his eyes. Now what do we have as a type here? Well, his eyes have been put out. What happened to King Zedekiah when he was taken by the king of Babylon? His eyes were put out. This is symbolic of his eyes being put out so that he has no eyes to see. And who was it that removed his hair and caused his eyes to be put out? An harlot. Do we see shades of the book of Revelation and mystery harlot? The mystery harlot Babylon, the mother of abominations of the earth? And they brought him down to Gaza and bound him with fetters of brass. And he did grind in the prison house. In other words, grind is probably struggled. Verse 22. Howbeit the hair of his head began to grow again after he was shaven. In other words, a little bit of help from God here. Verse 23. And the lords of the Philistines gathered them together to offer a great sacrifice unto Dagon, their god. And you'll notice God is in lowercase g here. Dagon was a fish god worshipped also by the Ninevites. And to rejoice. And they said, Our God, again lowercase, hath delivered Samson our enemy into our hand. Verse 24. Actually, if you really want to get the spiritual significance of this, think about the false Christ coming and delivering the faithful up before him. In other words, their God, lowercase g. Well, Satan, Lucifer, is a false god. He is not a god. No more than Dagon was. Dagon wasn't even a real god. He was a mythical fish god. Verse 24. And the people saw him and praised their God, lowercase g, and said, Our God, lowercase g, hath delivered into our hands our enemy, the destroyer of our country, which slew many of us. Verse 25. And it came to pass when their hearts were merry, in other words, they'd probably all been drinking and they're all happy and doing no telling what all else. They said, Call for Samson that he may make us sport. In other words, they wanted to make sport of him or to make fun of him and to basically rub in what had happened to him and chide him. The same as was done to our Lord by the Romans and by the Sanhedrin when they were smiting him with the palm of their fists, and when the Romans planted the crown of thorns on his head and clothed him with a scarlet purple cloak. In other words, what this basically means is they want to mock him. And they called for Samson out of the prison house, and he made them sport. And they set him between the pillars. Verse 26. And Samson said unto the lad that held him by the hand, in other words, the one that was leading him around, Suffer me that I may fill the pillars whereupon the house standeth, that I may lean upon them. Verse 27. Now the house was full of men and women, And all the lords of the Philistines were there, and there were upon the roof about 3,000 men and women that beheld while Samson made sport. In other words, while they're mocking him and chiding him and basically rubbing it in his face what has happened to him. Verse 28. And Samson called unto the Lord and said, O Lord God, remember me. I pray thee, and strengthen me. I pray thee only this once, O God, that I may be avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. In other words, for my eyes to see. Verse 29. And Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars upon which the house stood. In other words, these were the 2 central pillars that held up the entire house, and on which it was borne up. Well, there's your proof. The one with his right hand and the other with his left hand. Verse 30. And Samson said, Let me die with the Philistines. And he bowed himself with all his might. And the house fell upon the lords and upon the people that were therein, so that the dead which were slew at his death, in other words, the deaths of Samson, were more than were slew, or which he had slew in his life. In other words, there were 3,000 men upon the roof and no telling how many down in the house. So right now he's just killed more than he's killed in his entire life. Verse 31. And his brethren and all the house of his father came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the burying place of Manoah his father. And he judged Israel 20 years. In other words, he was the judge over Israel for 20 years. Judges chapter 17 and verse 1. And there was a man of Mount Ephraim whose name was Micah. Verse 2. And he said unto his mother, The 1,100 shekels of silver which were taken from thee, about which thou cursedst and spakest also in my ears, behold, the silver is with me. I took it. And his mother said, Blessed be thou of the Lord, my son. Verse 3. And when he had restored the 1,100 of shekels of silver to his mother said, I had wholly dedicated the silver unto the Lord from my hand for my son, to make a graven and molten image. Now therefore I will restore it unto thee. Verse 4. Yet he restored the money unto his mother, and his mother took 200 shekels of silver, and gave to him the founder, who made thereof a graven image of a molten image, and they were in the house of Micah. Verse 5. And the man Micah had an house of gods. Again, you will notice the lowercase g. In other words, apparently this household was one of those that worshipped a lot of gods, much like when Paul came to Mars Hill. There were they had a temple to every god that you could think of, and even one to the unknown god, because they didn't want to leave anyone out. Verse 5. And the man Micah had a house of gods, and had made an ephod and a teraphim, and consecrated one of his sons, whom became a priest. And a teraphim is, of course, an idol of worship, but it's likened to a being with wings, or likened to an angelic form, as we see the word I am on the end of that word teraphim, like as in seraphim, or Raphaim, or Nephilim. Anytime you see the word I am at the end of a word, usually it has to do with angelic beings, or the terrestrial. Or not terrestrial, celestial. Verse 6. In those days there was no king in Israel, but every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Well, that's where a lot of them made their mistake. Verse 7. And there was a young man out of Bethlehem, Judah, of the family of Judah, who was a Levite. and he sojourned there. Verse 8. And the man departed out of the city from Bethlehem, Judah, to sojourn where he could find a place. And he came to Mount Ephraim, to the house of Micah, as he sojourned. Verse 9. And Micah said unto him, Whence comest thou? And he said unto him, I am a Levite of Bethlehem, Judah. I go to sojourn where I might find a place. In other words, he's probably looking for a place to live or a piece of land to call his own or to buy or what have you. Verse 10. And Micah said unto him, Dwell with me, and be unto me a father and a priest. And I will give thee 10 shekels of silver by the year, and a suit of apparel, and thy victuals, in other words, your food. I'll take care of your clothes and your food, and I'll pay you. So the Levite went in. Verse 11. And the Levite was content to dwell with the man, and the young man was one unto him even as one of his sons. Verse 12. And Micah consecrated the Levite, the young man, became his priest, and was in the house of Micah. Verse 13. And Micah said, Now know I that the Lord will do me good, seeing that I have a Levite to my priest. In other words, Micah apparently familiar with the Levitical priest line, and that they were the tribe that God had chosen to be the priests, even though he's not very smart for having molten idols. Verse 18. In those days there was no king in Israel. And in those days the tribes of the Danites sought them an inheritance to dwell in. For unto that day all their inheritance had not fallen unto them amongst the tribes of Israel. Verse 2. And the children of Dan set their family, 5 men from their coast, men of valor, in other words, fighters, from Zorah unto Eshtaol, to spy out the land and to search it. And they came unto them, and they said unto them, Go search the land. And when they came to Mount Ephraim, to the house of Micah, they lodged there. Verse 3. And when they were in the house of Micah, they knew the voice of the young man, the Levite, and they turned in thither, and said unto him, Who brought thee hither? And what makest thou in this place? What hast thou here? Verse 4. And he said unto them, Thus and thus dealeth Micah with me, and hath hired me, and I am his priest. Verse 5. And they said unto him, Ask counsel, we pray thee, of God, that we might know whether our way which we go shall be prosperous. In other words, they're looking for an inheritance, a piece of land. Verse 6. And the priest said unto them, Go in peace, before the Lord is your way wherein ye go. Verse 7. Then the 5 men departed, and came to Laish, and saw the people that were therein, how they dwelt careless, after the manner of the Zidonians, quiet and secure. There was no magistrate in the land that might put them into shame in anything, and they were far from the Zidonians, and had no business with any man. In other words, they're kind of to themselves, but they're dwelling in relative peacefulness. Verse 8. And they came to their brethren, to Zorah and Eshtaol, and their brethren said unto them, What say ye? In other words, they've returned now from looking it over. Verse 9. And they said, Arise, that we may go up against them. For we have seen the land, and behold, it is very good. And are ye still? Be not slothful, go and enter and possess the land. In other words, get up off your hind side and let's get moving, and go possess this land. Verse 10. When ye go, ye shall come unto a people secure, unto a large land, for God hath given it into your hands, a place where there is no want of anything that is in the earth. Verse 11. And there went out from thence the family of the Danites, out of Zorah, and out of Eshtaol, 600 men appointed with weapons of war. Verse 12. And they went up and pitched in Kirjath-jearim in Judah. Wherefore they called the place Manhanadan unto this day, behold, it is behind Kirjath-jearim. Verse 13. And they passed thence unto Mount Ephraim, and came unto the house of Micah. Verse 14. Then answered the 5 men that went out to spy out the country of Laish, and said unto their brethren, Do ye know that there is in these houses an ephod, and a teraphim, and graven image, and a molten image? Now therefore consider what ye have to do. Verse 15. And they turned thitherward, and came into the house of the young man, the Levite, even unto the house of Micah, and saluted him. Verse 16. And the 600 men appointed them their weapons of war, which were of the children of Dan, stood by the entering of the gate. Verse 17. And the 5 men that went to spy out the land went up, and came in thither, and they took the graven image, and the ephod, and the teraphim, and the molten image. And the priests stood in the entering of the gate with 600 men that were appointed with the weapons of war. Verse 18. And these went into Micah's house, and fetched the carved image, the ephod, the teraphim, and the molten image. Then said the priest unto them, What do ye? Verse 19. And they said unto him, Hold thy peace, lay thy hand upon thy mouth, and go with us, and be to us a father and a priest. It is better for thee to be a priest unto the house. It is better for thee to be a priest unto the house of one man, or that thou be a priest unto the tribe of the family of Israel, or a family in Israel. Verse 20. And the priest's heart was glad, and he took the ephod and the teraphim and the graven image, and went in the midst of the people. Verse 21. So they turned and departed, and put the little ones and the cattle on the carriage before them. Verse 22. And when they were a good way from the house of Micah, the men that were there in the houses near to Micah's house were gathered together, and overtook the children of Dan. Verse 23. And they cried unto the children of Dan, and they turned their faces, and said unto Micah, What aileth thee, that thou comest with such a company? Verse 24. And he said, Ye have taken away my gods. Notice again, lowercase g, which I made, and the priest, and ye are gone away. And what have I more? And what is it that ye say unto me, What aileth thee? In other words, he's ticked off, and he's asking him, You've taken my priest and my gods, and you want to know what's wrong with me? Verse 25. And the children of Dan said unto him, Let not thy voice be heard among us, lest angry fellows run upon thee, and thou lose thy life, and the lives of thy household. In other words, be careful of your words. And the children of Dan went their way, and when Micah saw that they were too strong for him, he turned back and went into his house. Verse 27. And he took the things which Micah had made, and the priest which he had, and came unto Laish, unto a people that were quiet and secure, and then smote them with the edge of the sword, and burnt the city with fire. And I probably should have said they took the things, not he took the things. And this is talking about the Danites. Verse 28. And there was no deliverer, because it was far from Sidon, and they had no business with any man. In other words, they were pretty much to themselves. And it was in a valley that lieth by Beth Rahab, as they built a city and dwelt therein. Verse 29. And they called the name of the city Dan, after the name of Dan, their father, who was born unto Israel. Howbeit the name of the city was Laish at the first. Verse 30. And the children of Dan set up the graven image, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, he and his sons were the priests of the tribes of Dan until the day of the captivity of the land. Verse 31. And they set them up Micah's graven image, which he made, all the time that the house of God was in Shiloh. Verse 19. And it came to pass in those days, when there was no king in Israel, that there were certain Levites sojourning, or there was a certain Levite sojourning on the side of Mount Ephraim, which took him a concubine out of Bethlehem, Judah. Verse 2. And his concubine played the whore against him, and went away from him unto her father's house to Bethlehem, Judah, and was there 4 whole months. Verse 3. And her husband arose and went after her to speak friendly unto her. In other words, he was going to be nice and to bring her again, having his servant with him and a couple of asses. And she brought him into her father's house. And when the father of the damsel saw him, he rejoiced to meet him. In other words, he was glad to meet him. Verse 4. And his father-in-law, the damsel's father, retained him, that he abode with them 3 days. So they did eat and drink and lodge there. Verse 5. And it came to pass on the 4th day, when they arose early in the morning, that he rose up to depart. But the damsel's father said unto his son-in-law, Comfort thine heart with a morsel of bread, and afterward go your way. Verse 6. And they sat down, and did eat and drink, both of them together. For the damsel's father had said unto the man, Be content, I pray thee, and tarry all night, and let thine heart be merry. In other words, they're probably drinking wine and getting a little bit tipsy. Verse 7. And when the man rose up to depart, his father-in-law urged him, therefore he lodged there again. In other words, he stayed another night. Verse 8. And he arose early on the 5th day to depart, and the damsel's father said, Comfort thine heart, I pray thee. And they tarried until afternoon, and they did eat, both of them. In other words, they sat there and ate together. Verse 9. And when the man rose up to depart, his concubine and his servant and his father-in-law, the damsel's father, said unto him, Behold, now the day draweth toward evening. I pray you, tarry all night. Behold, the day groweth to an end. Lodge here, and thine heart may be merry, and tomorrow get ye early on your way, that ye may goest home. Verse 10. But the man would not tarry all night. He rose up and departed, and came over against Jebus, which is Jerusalem. At least it would become Jerusalem later on in history. And there was with him 2 asses saddled, his concubine also with him. Verse 11. And when they were by Jebus, the day was far spent, and the servant said unto his master, Come, I pray thee, let us turn into this city of the Jebusites, and lodge in it. Verse 12. And his master said unto him, We will not turn aside hither into this city of a stranger, for it is not the children of Israel. We will pass over to Gibeah. And of course, Jebus was occupied by the Jebusites at this time, which is why it is written that Jerusalem was born of an unclean birth. In other words, the Jebusites still inhabit it. Verse 13. And he said unto his servant, Come, let us draw near unto the places and lodge all night in Gibeah or in Ramah. Verse 14. And they passed on and went their way, and the sun went down on them, and they were by Gibeah, which belongeth to Benjamin. Verse 15. And they turned aside thither to go in and lodge in Gibeah, and when they went in, he sat him down in the street in the city, and there was no man that took them into his house for lodging. In other words, they went into Benjamin and didn't receive the warmest of welcomes. Verse 16. And behold, there came an old man from his work out of the field at even, and he was also of Mount Ephraim, and he sojourned in Gibeah, but the men of the place were Benjamites. Verse 17. And when he had lifted up his eyes, he saw a wayfaring man in the street of the city. And the old man said, Whither goest thou, and whence comest thou? Verse 18. And he said unto them, We are passing from Bethlehem, Judah, toward the side of Mount Ephraim. And thence am I, and went to Bethlehem, Judah. And I am now going to the house of the Lord, and there is no man that receiveth me to house. In other words, nobody's going to let me lodge with him. Verse 19. Yet there is both straw and provender for our asses, and there is bread and wine also for me, and for thy handmaid, and for the young man which is with thy servants. There is no want of anything. Verse 20. And the old man said, Peace be with thee. Howsoever, let all thy wants lie upon me. Only lodge not in the street. In other words, don't stay out in the street at night. And this is good advice even to this day in many places. Verse 21. And he brought him into the house, and gave him provender unto the asses, and he washed their feet, and did eat and drink. Verse 22. Now as they were making their hearts merry, in other words, probably drinking a little bit of wine and eating bread, behold, the men of the city, certain sons of Belial, remember that word Belial, beset the house round about, and beat at the door, and spake to the master of the house, the old man, saying, Bring forth the man that came into thine house, that we may know him. Now, where have we seen this type before? Remember what happened to Lot and the two men that entered into his house at Sodom? In other words, we've got the same exact thing here. They don't want to just know them. They don't want to meet them and shake their hands and say, Hi, how are you? Nice to meet you. They want to know them as in the biblical sense to know them. They want to do the homosexual act of sex, you might say. And the word Belial here is the sons of Belial. The word Belial means worthless, useless, destruction, and this actually is one of the names of Satan when it comes right down to it by type and example. It means the sons of Belial. You can pretty much guess. In some cases, I would say these were the Kenites, but I think these here are probably worthless children of Benjamin, or worthless dwellers that were dwelling amongst Benjamin, which they could be Kenites, but the sons of destruction, the sons of worthlessness, the sons of that destroyeth is what this means. The sons of Belial. Anyway, again, Satan's name is the destroyer, so this could be referring to Kenites. Verse 23. And the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said unto them, Nay, my brethren, nay, I pray you, do not so wickedly. He said exactly what Lot said in the time of Sodom. Seeing that this man has come into my house, do not this folly. In other words, this wicked thing. Verse 24. Behold, here is my daughter a maiden, and his concubine. Them I will bring out, and humble ye them. In other words, two daughters here, just as Lot's two daughters. And do with them what seemeth good unto you, but unto this man do not so vile a thing. Now see, if they just wanted to know them and be friends with them and get to know them, it's not a vile thing. This is talking about the sexual act. Verse 25. But the men would not hearken unto him. So the man took his concubine and brought her forth unto them, and they knew her, and they abused her all night until morning. And when the day began to spring, they let her go. Then came the woman in the dawning of the day, and fell down at the door of the man's house, where her Lord was, till it was light. Verse 27. And her Lord rose up in the morning, and opened the doors of the house, and went out to go his way. And behold, the woman his concubine was fallen down at the door of the house, and her hands were upon the threshold. Verse 28. And he said unto her, Up, let us be going. But none answered. You know why? Because she was dead. She had been raped to death. Then the man took her upon his ass, and the man rose up and got him into his place. Verse 29. And when he was come to his place, he took a knife, and laid hold on his concubine, and divided her together with her bones into 12 pieces, and sent her to all the coasts of Israel. And he did this so that all 12 tribes could be a witness to what had happened to this one woman. Verse 30. And it was so that all that saw it said, There was no such deed done nor seen from the day that the children of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt unto this day. Consider of it, take advice, and speak your minds. Judges chapter 20 and verse 1. Then all the children of Israel went out, and the congregation was gathered together as one man, from Dan even unto Beersheba, with the land of Gilead, unto the Lord in Mizpah. Verse 2. And the chief of all the people, even of all the tribes of Israel, presented themselves unto the assembly of the people of God, 400,000 footmen that drew the sword, or that drew sword. Verse 3. Now the children of Benjamin heard that the children of Israel were gone up to Mizpah. Then said the children of Israel, Tell us, how was this wickedness? In other words, how did this happen? Verse 4. And the Levite, the husband of the woman that was slain, answered and said, I came to Gibeah that belongeth to Benjamin, I and my concubine to lodge. Verse 5. And the men of Gibeah rose against me, and beset the house round about me all night, and thought to have slain me and my concubine. They have forced, and she is dead. In other words, they have forced means they have raped. That she is dead. Verse 6. And I took my concubine and cut her pieces, and sent her throughout all the country of the inheritance of Israel, for they have committed lewdness and folly in Israel. Verse 7. But all ye are children of Israel, give here your advice and counsel. In other words, I want to know what to do about this. Verse 8. And all the people rose as one, saying, We will not any of us go into his tent, neither will we any of us turn into his house. Verse 9. But now this shall be a thing which we will do to Gibeah. We will go up by lot against it. Verse 10. And we will take the men of 100 throughout all the tribes of Israel, and 100 of 1,000, and 1,000 of 10,000, and fetch victual or food for the people, that they may do when we come to Gibeah of Benjamin, according to all the folly which they have wrought in Israel. Verse 11. So all the men of Israel were gathered together against the city, knit together as one man. Verse 12. And the tribes of Israel sent men through all the tribe of Benjamin, saying, What wickedness is this that was done among you? Verse 13. Now for deliver us the men, the children of Belial, which are in Gibeah, that we may put them to death, and put away evil from Israel. But the children of Benjamin would not hearken unto the voice of their brethren, the children of Israel. Verse 14. But the children of Benjamin gathered themselves together into the cities of Gibeah to go out to battle against the children of Israel. Verse 15. And the children of Benjamin were in number at that time, out of the cities 26,000 men that drew the sword, beside the inhabitants of Gibeah, which were numbered 700 chosen men. Verse 16. Among all this people were 700 chosen men, left-handed. Everyone could sling stones at a hair breadth and not miss. In other words, they were very accurate when it comes to slinging stones, a lot like David will be. Verse 17. And the men of Israel, beside Benjamin, were numbered 400,000 men that drew the sword. All these were men of war. In other words, they were ready for war and able to fight war. Verse 18. And the children of Israel arose and went up to the house of God and asked counsel of God, which said, Which of us shall go up first against the children of Benjamin? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up first. Verse 19. And the children of Israel rose up in the morning and encamped against Gibeah. Verse 20. And the men of Israel went out to battle against Benjamin, and the men of Israel put themselves in array to fight against them at Gibeah. Verse 21. And the children of Israel, or the children of Benjamin, came forth out of Gibeah, and destroyed down to the ground of the Israelites that day 22,000 men. Verse 22. And the people of Israel encouraged themselves. In other words, they built themselves back up. They didn't let this deter them. And set their battle again in array in the place where they had put themselves in array the first day. Verse 23. And the children of Israel went up and wept before the Lord until even, and asked counsel of the Lord, saying, Shall I go up again in battle against the children of Benjamin, my brother? And the Lord said, Go up against him. Verse 24. And the children of Israel came near against the children of Benjamin the second day. Verse 25. And the children of Benjamin went forth against them out of Gibeah the second day, and destroyed down to the ground of the children of Israel again 18,000 men, all these that drew the sword. Verse 26. And then the children of Israel and all the people went up and came into the house of God and wept and sat there before the Lord and fasted until even, and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. Verse 27. And the children of Israel inquired of the Lord, for the ark of the covenant was there in those days. In other words, it was still present. Verse 28. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, stood before it in those days, saying, Shall I yet again go out and battle against the children of Benjamin my brother, or shall I cease? And the Lord said, Go up, for tomorrow I will deliver them into thine hand. Verse 29. And Israel set liers in wait round about Gibeah. In other words, this time they're going to be a little more cunning. Verse 30. And the children of Israel went up against the children of Benjamin on the third day, and put themselves in array against Gibeah as at other times. In other words, as the two previous attacks. Verse 31. And the children of Benjamin went out against the people, and were drawn out from the city, and they began to smite the people, and to kill as other times in the highways, which one goeth up to the house of God, and the other goeth up to Gibeah in the field, about 30 men of Israel. Verse 32. And the children of Benjamin said, They are smitten down before us, as at the first. But the children of Israel said, Let us flee, and draw them out of the city into the highways. In other words, they're going to use one of Joshua's old tactics here. Verse 23. And all the men of Israel rose up out of their place, and put themselves in array at Baal Tamar. And the liers in wait of Israel came forth out of their places, even to the meadows of Gibeah. Verse 34. And there came out against Gibeah 10,000 chosen men out of all Israel. And the battle was sore, but they knew not if evil was near them, or that evil was near them. Verse 35. And the Lord smote Benjamin before Israel, and the children of Israel destroyed of Benjamin that day 25,100 men. All these that drew the sword, or all these drew the sword. verse 36. So the children of Benjamin saw that they were smitten, for the men of Israel gave place to the Benjamites, because they trusted unto the liers in wait, which they had set beside Gibeah. Verse 37. And the liers in wait hasted and rushed into Gibeah, and the liers in wait drew themselves along, and smote all the city with the edge of the sword. Verse 38. Now there was an appointed sign between the men of Israel and the liers in wait, that they should make a great flame with smoke rise up out of the city. Verse 39. And when the men of Israel retired in the battle, Benjamin began to smite and kill the men of Israel, about 30 persons. For they said, Surely we are smitten down, or surely they are smitten down before us, as in the first battle. Verse 40. But when the flame began to arise up out of the city with a pillar of smoke, the Benjamites looked behind them, and behold, the flame of the city ascended up to heaven. Verse 41. And the men of Israel turned again, and the men of Benjamin were amazed, for they saw that evil was come upon them. Verse 42. Therefore they turned their backs before the men of Israel unto the way of the wilderness, but the battle overtook them, and them which came out of the cities they destroyed in the midst of them. Verse 43. Thus they enclosed the Benjamites round about, and chased them, and trod them down with ease over against Gibeah toward the sun rising. In other words, towards the east. Verse 44. And there fell of Benjamin 18,000 men, all of them men of valor. Verse 45. And they turned and fled toward the wilderness unto the rock of Rimmon, and they gleaned of them in the highways 5,000 men, and pursued hard after them unto Gidom, and slew 2,000 men of them. Verse 46. So that all which fell that day of Benjamin were 25,000 which drew the sword. All these were men of valor. Verse 47. But 600 men turned and fled into the wilderness unto the rock of Rimmon, and abode in the rock of Rimmon 4 months. Verse 48. And the men of Israel turned again upon the children of Benjamin, and smote them with the edge of the sword, as well the men of every city, and as the beast, and all that came to hand, and they set on fire all the cities that they came to. In other words, they're making an example out of these Benjamites who would not cooperate with them to deliver these sons of Belial. And you've got a type even in that of the Kenites dwelling amongst the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. But I think this is a good place to stop for this particular lecture. We'll pick it up in the next chapter, which will be Judges chapter 21. But it is my prayer for you always, brothers and sisters in Christ, that you will take heed to these words and learn by example of these children of Israel who turned away from God and turned away from God and turned away from God, and took to themselves graven images, and allowed filth amongst themselves, sons of Belial, which are symbolic of the Kenite, even if these particular ones were not Kenites. They probably were. But take the spiritual examples and the types to heart, so that you understand. Because all of these fell by the sword. They would not cooperate with their own brethren, the children of Israel. Because they were children of Israel too. Benjamin was a tribe of Israel. At any rate, may our Father bless you in the study of His Word. And may He reward you, those of you who look deeply into His Word and seek His counsel and His wisdom, to give glory unto His name through the study of His Word. God bless you, and thank you for listening. This has been Just Thoughts.